Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the New England Biography series sponsored by the Massachusetts Historical Society. My name is Kanasoran Wongstri Chanalai. I am the Director of Research here at the MHS. So first off, let me make a quick plug for our various seminar programs at the Massachusetts Historical Society. We have 7 seminar series that run over the course of the academic year. So from September through May, we are at the end of the season now. We only have one more program after this one next Tuesday in the Pauline Maier Early American History Seminar, and that is a special program to honor the historian Bernard Bailyn. But do check our website, masshist.org, for next season's programs, and we shall start them up again in September. But as you can see, there's a little something for everyone, from environmental history to biography to African American history to digital history projects. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce your moderator for this evening. A member of the steering committee for the New England Biography series, Professor Natalie Dykstra is a professor of English at Hope College, where she teaches the courses Introduction to Literary Studies, American Writers in Paris, Biography and Narratives, and American Women Writers. Professor Dykstra is author of Clover Adams, A Gilded and Heartbreaking Life, for which she received an NEH Fellowship. The book was a finalist for a Massachusetts Book Award and named Best Biography of 2012 by the Arts and Literature Review Open Letters Monthly. A 2019 National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar, Professor Dykstra is working on her latest project, which is titled Isabella Stewart Gardner, A Life in Art, scheduled for publication in 2023. Professor Dykstra, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. This is the third and last event of the New England Biography series. I want to thank my co-directors of the series, Megan Marshall and Julie Dubrow. We three would like to thank everyone at the MHS for hosting this series and for everything Kit and Katie do so expertly behind the scenes. Thank you too to the MHS president, Catherine Allgore, for her ongoing support. We're especially indebted to our marvelous panelists, Caroline Weber and Channing Joseph. This panel was first scheduled for the week of March 13, 2020. I remember not being sure of what I would wear to a panel on fashion. I won't ever forget the flurry of emails and texts going back and forth that week when it became clear we couldn't gather safely in person. So here we are at last to talk about fashion and biography. A little bit about our plan so you know what to expect. I want to say a few sentences about our theme and then introduce our speakers. They will talk briefly about their work and show some images, and then I'll begin with a series of questions followed by questions they have for each other. Please think about your questions for Caroline and Channing and post those in the chat function, and we'll be sure to leave enough time. What Virginia Woolf wrote about fashion in her biographical novel, Orlando, is often cited and apt for us tonight. Quote, "Vain trifles as they seem, clothes have more important offices than to merely keep us warm. Clothes change our view of the world and the world's view of us." Unquote. Fashion is a frame and a language, a way to speak what one doesn't say, a way to hide while on display. This was the case for Isabella Stewart Gardner, who deployed fashion to stand out, to cultivate social power, to assemble a persona. And this is a photograph that you're seeing from the MHS archives of the Artist Festival for the Fancy Ball, held at the MFA in April 1889. Isabella is standing third from the left in the back row in her Venetian costume. So that's what we'll be talking about together, this nexus of fashion and biography and how style matters. So let me introduce our panelists. Caroline Weber is a scholar of French literature and culture and a professor at Barnard College, Columbia University. Currently, she's on sabbatical as a Guggenheim Fellow and as the Mary Ellen Vanderheiden Fellow at the Cullman Center for Writers and Scholars at the New York Public Library. Her books include Queen of Fashion, What Marie-Antoinette Wore to the Revolution, and more recently, Proust's Duchess. Proust's Duchess was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Biography and won the French Heritage Society Book Award. Caroline's essays have appeared in such outlets as the New York Times, T, the New York Times Style Magazine, the London Review of Books, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Town and Country, Vogue, W Magazine, Book Forum, and LitHub. She is currently at work on a history of European royalty in crisis during the Belle Epoque. Channing Joseph is a recipient of the Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant, the Leon Levy Center for Biography Fellowship, and the Logan Nonfiction Fellowship for his forthcoming book, House of Swan, where slaves became queens and changed the world. The book is the untold true story of William Dorsey Swann, a formerly enslaved man and the first self-described drag queen who resisted police surveillance and suppression to organize secret cross-dressing dances nearly a century before Stonewall. The 2019 Whiting Foundation grant jury wrote that, quote, "It's impossible not to be excited about Channing Joseph's great feat of historical research, which complicates and expands our understanding of the history of LGBTQ activism and African-American history." A former staff journalist at the New York Times and Associated Press, Channing's reporting and essays have appeared around the globe in the Times, the International Herald Tribune, the Guardian, the Atlantic, the Nation, and many other publications. He teaches journalism at the University of Southern California. So welcome, both of you. Carolyn, would you like to start us off and tell us about your work?
Oh, sure, yes. First of all, I want to thank you, Natalie, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, Channing, for being here, because I'm really looking forward to getting to chat about this subject with both of you. And then to Kid and Katie and everyone at the MHS for having me along. I was saying on our tech call not long ago that I was really happy that our event didn't become a super spreader event for the coronavirus and that we weren't responsible for infecting all of the people who would have come out to see us. So thank you all, also those of you who are watching us today at home on Zoom. And yes, it's a big relief not to have to go out in the world and talk about fashion, because I was on like a 2-year book tour for my Marie-Antoinette book, which was very much about fashion. And I felt like I had to wear a different outfit to every appearance, and that's exhausting. Today I'm wearing yoga pants, and it's a preferable way to live. But I thought I would start by talking about my 2 most recent books, and the only 2 books that I've written for a general public before, although the one I'm working on now will also be a trade publication. And because this subject is so dear to my heart, it's really fun to get to think again about why and how fashion presented itself to me as an important topic in the work that I was doing. So if I could please have the first slide, or the next slide, in my little mini presentation. I only have a few slides, but if I could have the next one, yes. So my book, Marie-Antoinette, What Marie-Antoinette Wore to the Revolution, started from a very simple premise, which was that while I was writing my first academic book on political oratory during the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror, I noticed that no matter how weighty and ponderous, and sometimes to me slightly boring, the political speeches I was reading were, there were a surprising number of references to the way the Queen was dressed. And from people who were, had appeared before the National Assembly to talk about the price of corn or relationships with England, or, again, all kinds of weighty and important matters of state, kept being interrupted by references to things that Marie-Antoinette had worn. And so I kept a little file on these references, and I just made a note to myself that I wanted to understand why, at one of the most kind of important watershed moments in Western history, the people who were responsible for destroying a monarchy that was nearly 1,000 years old, and the society that went with it, and the religious institutions that went with it, and were tasked with inventing a whole new kind of modern way of living, why these people kept talking about what the Queen had chosen to wear on any given day. So that led me to a book project where I basically educated myself on what 18th century fashion was and on what it meant to Marie-Antoinette and her contemporaries. And as somebody who follows fashion and who writes sometimes for the fashion press and fashion magazines, I was also interested because Marie-Antoinette, as shown by this slide, has remained such a kind of staple reference for contemporary fashion designers. So just last year, at the beginning of the pandemic, Thom Browne released this amazing collection that was all inspired by Marie-Antoinette. But beyond the kind of archetypal elements that fashion designers still borrow from today, the kind of, beehive hairdo and the big hoop skirts and the frills, I wanted to look more specifically at two particular elements of dress that Marie-Antoinette really became known for in her time, and that were actually very controversial in their day and really went a long way towards making and unmaking her reputation as the Queen of France. So if I may have my next slide, please. Okay, so the first of Marie-Antoinette's two great fashion innovations was actually not really a clothing style at all, it was a hairstyle. And Marie-Antoinette, for those of you who are fuzzy on her biography, I will tell you that Marie-Antoinette was born in 1755 in Austria. She belonged to the Imperial House of Habsburg, and she was married off at the tender age of 15 to the future King of France, the Dauphin Louis Auguste, who became Louis XVI. She arrives in France in 1770, and is quickly kind of learns and is told that her main job as the future queen is to have a bunch of children to shore up the dynastic succession for the House of Bourbon, the royal house she's married into. But her husband, who has been taught from a young age that Austrians are responsible for everything bad that had ever happened to him, including the death of both of his parents, who he was told were poisoned by Austrian spies, he was afraid of Marie-Antoinette and basically avoided her as much as he could, and they didn't consummate their marriage for the first 7 years that Marie-Antoinette was in France. And so Marie-Antoinette not only had a lot of time on her hands, but she was really under a lot of pressure to try to formulate another kind of identity for herself, another raison d'être for being the highest ranked woman in the court of Versailles. The King Louis XV, who was the king when she got there and was the grandfather of her husband, he was a widower. And so Marie-Antoinette was effectively the Queen of Versailles. But without children, how would she be kind of a person of any importance in the eyes of her subjects, in the eyes of the courtiers? Marie-Antoinette quickly gravitated toward fashion as a way to set herself apart. The language you used, Natalie, to talk about Isabella Stewart Gardner, to set herself apart, to cultivate social authority, to assemble a persona. These were all exactly the things that Marie-Antoinette was looking to do when she discovered an unknown but up-and-coming accessories designer in Paris called Rose Bertin. Marie-Antoinette met Rose Bertin in 1775, 1774, the year that she and Louis ascended the throne. And Rose Bertin had really kind of come into a new industry that was just developing then, which allowed women who were members of the Mercers Guild by marriage to branch out and do their own businesses, providing accessories to dresses, providing accessories to shoes and jackets and other clothes. And they were called a marchand de mode, fashion merchantesses. And their real contribution was basically helping people turn these very complicated, ornate and expensive costumes that they had to wear at court, especially if you were royalty or in the aristocracy, and making them look new again. It cost a lot of money and took a lot of time to re-sew a brand new dress like the one that you see on this image of Marie-Antoinette from 1775 from an early fashion magazine in Paris. those clothes took a long time to make. They were protected by guild law and union law and all this stuff. But if you were a marchand de mode, you could make them look new again by coming up with trimmings. Rose Bertin was essentially the first great stylist of Western fashion history that I've been able to find. And she encouraged her clients not only to redecorate their dresses with silk flowers and lace and bows and flounces and all these things that made a tired old dress look new again, but she encouraged them to look at their hair as a canvas for further sartorial experimentation. And so with Marie-Antoinette, she developed this headdress known as the pouf. It was about 3 feet high, and it was constructed on a bed of chicken wire and horsehair and pomade, and basically the wearer could use it to express any current event or preference that was dear to her heart. This was predominantly, or in fact entirely apparently, a female fashion statement, and Marie-Antoinette made it her own. On my left, you see one of the more famous poufs that Marie-Antoinette developed, which is called the pouf à la belle poule, which is a fully rigged man-o-war that she donned to show her patriotic fervor as the new Queen of France when France won an important naval victory against the English in our American War of Independence. On the right, you see Marie-Antoinette in this kind of just feather and flower concoction that was known as a pouf à la reine, the Queen's pouf, which was her particular style that she adored, and it guaranteed that in any gathering, she would be the one who drew every eye. This image is also interesting because Marie-Antoinette was the first European royal, again, that I've ever found, who was depicted with her own features and her own name in the fashion press, which also got going at around this time. Just as these Rose Bertin accessories purveyors were developing this new industry for essentially fast fashion and changing your look all the time, the press followed suit, and Marie-Antoinette became essentially the heroine of the fashion press, as well as sort of the fashion icon of the 1770s and 1780s. May I please have the next slide? So that's Marie-Antoinette dressing way up. And Marie-Antoinette, in the beginning, the French public was kind of in love with her. They loved seeing this wackily and inventively and daringly attired and accessorized young queen. But France was falling on hard economic times in the 1770s and 80s, due in no small part to their contribution to our American War of Independence. And Marie-Antoinette, about 3 or 4 years into her reign, really came under fire for spending so much money on these frivolous fashions. In response to kind of increasing public animosity against her and the royal family generally, and in her case, that animosity was really tinted with a strong overlay of anti-Austrian sentiment and misogyny. She was the first kind of powerful woman that had been in the public eye in France in a very long time. In fact, basically throughout the history of the Bourbon reign, which had begun in the early 17th century, Marie-Antoinette was the first queen who really kind of claimed a big public presence for herself. She was, again, spending 7 years not having children and retiring into the background. But in the face of a lot of public animosity about her spending and her frivolity, she retreated into this kind of faux peasant paradise called the Petit Trianon, where she decided that wearing the kind of heavy, cumbersome dresses that were required at court was just inconvenient and uncomfortable. And with, again, Rose Bertin, she pioneered another look, which was essentially the first kind of fancy dress down style in French costume history. It was known as the chemise or the gall dress. And it was borrowed, as you can see from this slide of women in Santo Domingo, from the women who worked on the plantations, both the slaves and the plantation owners' wives in the French Caribbean colonies, where fancy French people liked to send their laundry to be bleached. They would send their clothes to get clean all the way to the colonies, and that's how they discovered these beautiful and kind of functional white, almost slip dresses that were much more comfortable to wear in the heat and outdoors. Marie-Antoinette became a huge partisan and sort of fashion leader of this look. And according to one of her contemporaries, this white chemise dress made out of simple muslin or cotton, very cool, relatively unstructured, and calling for a whole new set of accessories, straw hats and little kind of rustic sashes and kind of little baskets and things, a lot of adorable faux shepherdess kind of accessories. This became really the predominant look of the 1780s. And one of her contemporaries said famously that once Marie-Antoinette started to wear the chemise dress, even though she was retreating to her own kind of rustic paradise at the Petit Trianon, the streets of Paris were flooded with white dresses. So this was another big fashion statement that she pioneered, and it was really an important one to her, signifying her breakaway from court, her attempt to carve out a space of her own outside of the confines of a very rigidly hierarchical Bourbon court. I'd now like to pass just very, very briefly to, if I could have my next slide, please, to something I would hope to come back to when we're doing our discussion with each other, which was the main fashion element of my book, Proust's Duchess, where I looked at the 3 real-life noblewomen who inspired Marcel Proust's character of the Duchess de Guermantes in his novel In Search of Lost Time. These were women living in Paris in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And in the opening scene of my book, when I was trying to kind of get my head around who these 3 ladies were, who were not nearly as well known as someone like Marie-Antoinette, I was introduced to their personalities because the first place I discovered where all 3 of them had been in the same place at the same time was at an 1885 costume ball hosted by the woman on my right, who was called the Princesse de Sagan, and who was liked to think of herself as the modern day, the fin de siècle reincarnation of Marie-Antoinette. She gave a ball every year at which she always found some excuse to dress kind of like Marie-Antoinette. And my 3 ladies first assembled in 1884 at her so-called peasant ball, where she wore one of these white chemise dresses like Marie-Antoinette, and the 3 other women who, whose biographies I was trying to reconstruct all kind of showed up in costumes that were very typical of their personalities. The woman in the center of the image from the newspaper there on my left was Laure de Chevigny, one of my 3 women, and she went as a little baker woman a la Louis XVI, showcasing kind of her knowledge of French Revolutionary history when Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were taken prisoner by the people and dragged from Versailles back to Paris. They were done so because they were said to be the baker, the baker's wife, and the little baker boy. So Laure de Chevigny, who loved her connections to royalty, dressed as a little baker. My Elizabeth Greffule, who fancied herself the queen of Paris, actually just dressed randomly as a 17th century French princess. And then Geneviève Strauss, who was kind of an honorary member of high society and not officially part of it because she was bourgeoise and Jewish, dressed as a little frog. So their costume choices really gave me a little bit of an insight into their personalities at the beginning of an investigation into their lives. And I wound up kind of being able to draw all the way through that book on the costuming choices that they made specifically at these very public events, which were these annual costume balls hosted by the presumed latter-day Marie Antoinette. So fashion was an indispensable tool for me in understanding these women's trajectories, and I'm excited to hear more about Channing's project now.
So thank you so much, Caroline, for such a great presentation. Thank you, Natalie and MHS for having me. My presentation, I promise to hopefully to keep it short. Let me share my screen. So my presentation is on William Dorsey Swann. As Natalie kindly pointed out earlier in my intro, William Dorsey Swann was the first documented person to self-describe as a drag queen or a queen of drag. On the right is a newspaper clipping from an 1887 newspaper article from the National Republican in Washington, D.C. And the headline is "The Queen Raided, Unexpected Interruption to Her Banquet and Ball." The story is the front page story about a police raid on Swann's ball. Actually, this is from 1888. I think I misspoke and said 1887. 1888. It was an article about police raid on Swann's ball. the article stated that Swan had been celebrating a birthday with a group of friends. One of the interesting bits about it is that the journalist who writes the story makes a reference and says that something to the effect that this is a group of people that's quite small. Of all the people that have gathered here at this rated gathering today, it must be quite a small number, which indicates, I think, the extent to which this whole notion of queer culture or queer identity was totally brand new to people from 1888 in Washington, D.C. I'm going to go to the next slide. In this is actually the first article that I ever found about Swan. This is years ago. I was sort of, doing my thing as a nerdy historian type, digging through archival material, searching through for references to anything queer, particularly Black and queer, because I wanted to know more about people like me of the past, right? So this article I found was titled "The Negro Dive Rated." It's in the Washington Post, and the subtitle is 13 Black Men Dressed as Women Surprised at Supper and Arrested. The article describes what is deemed a drag dance or a drag party, in which Swan and several of his friends are gathered together, all dressed in women's clothing. The same event was covered in many newspapers, so you have many different angles about this particular story. But the gist of it is, this was such a shocking event to the neighborhood that they lived in Washington, D.C., that as the raid was occurring, the neighbors came out and watched as Swan and his friends were taken to the police station house, and jeered them as they were walked to the station. Some of the items that they wore were carefully described in the newspapers at the time. In part, I think, because of sort of a sarcastic attitude toward the idea that, as it was described at the time, even though these were Black men, it was considered that they were lowering their stature by stooping to dress as women. There was sort of no curiosity or thought that perhaps they were, perhaps some of them could identify as women if they had, perhaps the idea of transgender identity was not a concept that was available to them or even being discussed in the 19th century. This notion of queerness and identity that we have today, the sort of very, very specific notions of I choose my identity and I describe myself as gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender or genderqueer. None of those terms were yet available. At the time that Swan's this 1888 event occurred, the word homosexual had been invented by a German, but it had not yet appeared in any English language publication. So it was not even the ideas around sexuality and gender were simply not something that people in the public were familiar with. So something like this, something like Swan's ball, which he regularly held in private homes as the Queen. The Queen was a title at the time for the head of the gathering. So in modern parlance, we use the term Queen Now in the context of drag, we use the term queen to describe typically a male dressed as a woman. In Swan's day, it described the leader of the gathering. It described the person who had an honored place at the party. So the idea of fashion being a form of self-expression for Black men was a new concept. Let me go on to the next slide. The previous year, a smaller gathering had also been raided. It got much less attention, but this previous gathering helped to put Swan and his small queer group on actually, I don't know that it was small. I'm saying that, but it was an unknown number of people this previous gathering the previous year that was also raided helped put the Swan's queer underground on the radar of the local police and authorities. In this gathering, one of the newspapers, the Washington Critic, carefully noted all the items that were worn. The reporter wrote that they nearly all had on low neck and short sleeve silk dresses, several of them with trains. They all wore corsets, bustles, long hose, and slippers, and everything that goes to make a female's dress complete. One of them had on a pink satin Mother Hubbard dress trimmed with fur, a long wig and bangs and pink hose, and old gold slippers, bogus diamond earrings, and breastpins. And so, in a certain sense, you get a sense of their sense of fashion is both one that aspires to sort of a grand idea of being upper class. These are mostly Swan and the people he's gathering with. What we know about them is that they're mostly formerly enslaved Black men. So they're and mostly working as servants in the homes of Washington's elite. So they have from what they're wearing, descriptions of what they're wearing, you have a sense that they're aspiring to this upper class elite sense of fashion, but that they're also throwing together what they can find, right? The sense that, the old gold slippers, right? Maybe that's the only item that seemed appropriate to put together with that outfit. At the time, it's my sense in doing this research that there was a premium put on looking, as we would say in today's parlance, passing, and there was a premium put on looking as much like a woman and not being seen as cross-dressing. Particularly with Swan's group, you had there would have been, as you see, the sort of sense of shock that is generated by having these men gather together for a ball is it's enough to pull out all the neighbors from over hundreds of people out of their homes to walk them to the station. So this is a shocking thing. So there was no sense of trying to sort of flout fashion norms or to flout social norms publicly in a certain way. The point of these gatherings seems to have been for community self-expression and community support. They weren't, for the most part, walking in public, waiting to be seen, gawked at, and arrested. They were trying to fit in to some degree. I showed this picture because this is from a French postcard series from Le Nouveau Silk from 1903. There was a dance craze for an African-American dance called the Cakewalk, which was danced by formerly enslaved people during Swan's day. and I think it indicates something to of what the people who gathered at Swan's ball might have looked like. In 1903, the Cakewalk was a craze in France, and it was performed at all kinds of theaters. They hired African Americans to come to France to dance the Cakewalk, to dance this form of dance that had been invented by enslaved people. And the people in these pictures, the person dressed in pants, the name is unknown, and the person wearing a dress is named Jack Brown, who was an American performer from Virginia. Swan himself was born in Maryland in just before the Civil War. And I would love to share just a short clip of what there's no sound, I think, so it should be okay. A short clip of Jack Brown and his partner dancing the Cakewalk in Lyon, France in 1903. I showed this clip also to indicate, not just to get an idea of what Swan and his cohort might have been wearing, but also the importance, of the fact that Swan's gatherings were called dances. So they were dancing. It was important to wear items that not only allowed them to express themselves, or to express their identity or their emotions, but also to allow them to move freely and allowed them to have some ability to coordinate their legs and arms and so on. I'm going to stop this because that's another thing, and moving to the next one. So the last slide, I tried to keep it short. This is a fast forward to 1937, but it's a look at Swan's the queer culture of Washington D.C. literally 50 years after Swan's heyday. You find similarly Black queer people, some of whom might be considered trans if they were alive today, if they had the choice to identify with that term. That term did not exist. It's typically why I use the term queer, because at least queer would have been a word that would have been used to describe them, and that would have been familiar to them. LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, none of those would have been words that they would have understood. So the queer underground Black culture of Washington, D.C. continued to thrive despite suppression by the police, and by the 1930s was getting much more positive coverage in the press, particularly the Black press. Some things that continued to be true. These gatherings continued to be important for community support, for self-expression. As you can see from some of the photos, you can see that the self-expressive parts are pretty clear. And as you see on the right, a picture of Alden Garrison, who was a famous dancer in Washington, D.C., who identified as a female impersonator. Alden Garrison is dancing. So dance continued to be an important part of the culture. So fashion and dance came together to mark an important moment in African American history, particularly for queer folks. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, both of you, for wonderful presentations, and we have so much that we want to talk about. So together, your presentations bring to mind a wonderful quote by a scholar, Susan Heiner, who writes that fashion is an agent of both hierarchy and subversion. right?
Yeah.
That it moves to sort of fix a social identity and claim a social identity, but it also moves or is used to undermine or to rearrange and I just wondered if you could talk about that in relation to your work with your wonderful characters. So how fashion moves both to fix an identity, but also it can be used for survival. It can be used for to undermine identities, to recreate, so just wondered if you could speak a little bit. You already have, but I would love to hear more.
You want me to go first?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
okay. I was waiting for Caroline. Sorry. So
one is fine.
you know, in looking at Swan's life in particular, because Swan was born enslaved in Maryland in before the Civil War, and it is known that in many cases on plantations, female and male children were given very simple garments that barely covered their bodies, and essentially there was a unisex uniform that didn't distinguish between sexes. So in a certain way, Swan is coming from a society where he begins with a sort of freedom to not be defined. And as he grows, he is very much defined by the very strict gender roles of 19th century culture, right? Where women do these jobs, men do these jobs. And in his early life, moving from rural Maryland to Washington, D.C., at a time when there's lots of optimism among African Americans in particular, because slavery has ended and people aren't quite disillusioned yet about what the possibilities could be. They're thinking slavery ended. We didn't think it could ever end, and so what else might be possible in life? So there's a sense of optimism and possibility that confronts Swan as he comes to Washington, D.C. in his early life. And in Washington, D.C., for the first time, he finds this context where there are numbers of African American men and women gathered together in the Capitol, the center of power and prestige. And as opposed to, an earlier era, just a few years before, where their movements would have been very prescribed, where they had much less access to opportunities, to socializing, to meeting new people. You have suddenly this freedom to meet each other, to define themselves, and to explore different ways of expressing themselves. Swan gets to meet other queer men like himself, although we don't know that they would have described themselves as queer. I use that term because it makes it sort of easier in the context of modern language. I don't think they used words that globally described each other. I think they used words that described their actions. They said, we're going to gather together for a drag. Do you want to come? And when I'm there, I'll be Diana and you'll be Bessie, right? And so, and the queen will preside over us all, right? Yeah. So rather than this sort of modern notion that there's these strict identities and these strict ways of understanding subjectivity, I think there was much less focus on subjectivity. There was a lot of focus on what we can see you doing. And so because of that, people could move in and out of identities sort of more easily, right? One of Swan's close friends I know was married and had children, and yet hosted drag balls and participated in them and took great risk upon himself in doing that. So there is this, I think I wanted to say this one last thing, probably, just to tie it all up together, and in terms of your first slide, Natalie, the slide from a fancy ball, right? In the age prior to radio and television, what did people do for fun? They got together and dressed up. It was a very common activity. And so in the context of that common activity of gathering up to dress up, combining that with suddenly you have the freedom to meet other queer Black men, it's sort of obvious that Swan would come to DC and want to gather together and dress up with his new friends. So I think that's how it begins.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was actually thinking a lot, Channing, during your presentation, which I loved, about Versailles, which is in many ways, so Louis XIV, who ruled from the 1660s until 1715, was really the originator of royal power dressing in Europe. He grew up during a civil war when the nobility were trying to unseat the monarchy. And he devised all the sort of elaborate kind of beauty and spectacle and pageantry of Versailles, which featured a heavy dose of court dancing and fancy dress balls. All of that was really devised as a kind of a method of social control. By forcing the nobles to come and live with him at Versailles, he could observe them all the time. By forcing them to spend all of their money on finery, he could keep them from using that money to pay troops to overthrow him. So there was a real function to the glamour of the court of Versailles from its inception under Louis XIV in the 1660s. And that really continued right up until the French Revolution in 1789. And so, but I was also thinking about the fact, looking at your slides, that for instance, so Versailles was very hierarchical and everything was kind of a pyramid with the king at the top, and the king was chosen by God. And Louis XIV's brother, who was known as Monsieur, was the kind of the much better soldier of the two of them, the kind of much more macho in terms of his military accomplishments, but he dressed as a woman all the time. And there's kind of wonderful kind of commentary. And again, to your point about terminology, nobody was saying Monsieur is queer. The king's brother was the second most important man at Versailles, and therefore effectively in the universe for the people who lived there. And he would go out and fight these great battles, an incredible warrior, and then he'd come back and wear the most ornate and elaborate dresses to a ball. He had 2 wives. He had children because he had to. But he also had, many male lovers, and we get a lot of kind of contemporary commentary about the jewelry that they wore and the dresses and things. So there is kind of an incipient, I think, drag culture already at Versailles that's really fascinating. And it's fascinating to me to think about this kind of culture of pageantry and the affiliation to something like the cakewalk or the drag ball. And the way I think Marie-Antoinette comes into the story in an interesting way is that when Marie-Antoinette decided, as a young bride and somebody who is failing in her one slated gender role defined job, which is to have children for the Bourbon royal family, she was also at that time, as kind of a young teenager living at Versailles, she was being given lessons in royal history and royal genealogy. And like her husband, she descended from Louis XIV. And my claim in my book is that, and I think I've got some good material that supports it, is that she really discovered in Louis XIV somebody who looked to clothing at a moment of political insecurity and vulnerability and used it to kind of create a new form of authority. Louis XIV, after this civil war that almost ended his family's monarchy, he became the Sun King. He assumed these costumes. He prescribed this pageantry and this culture of dress up at Versailles, where hierarchy, to your comment, Natalie, was very legible from people's clothes. There were like a certain number of men at Versailles who, if the king was real, they were really in favor with the king, they were allowed to wear a certain shade of blue jacket. The number of lace cuffs on your jacket would also, or your dress, would show how noble you were, how in favor you were, how long your train was, how tight your corset was. All of these things were visible markers of social standing. And what's interesting is that all of that was formulated by a man. And within the kind of privileged world of Versailles, you couldn't get much more marginalized than a childless woman from Austria. And so Marie-Antoinette kind of learned from her ancestor and her husband's ancestor, Louis XIV, oh, I can dress up, I can assert myself visually. I can kind of claim this place I can claim visual attention, where otherwise my role, according to sort of standard gender prescriptions, is completely marginal. For the 7 years that her marriage wasn't consummated, there was constant discussion at court about sending her back to Austria. Many courtiers really didn't like that they had an Austrian woman on the throne. She was brought in for sort of specific diplomatic reasons, but the people who brought her in then were promptly disgraced and died. And she was left alone as the kind of symbol of an alliance that was really unpopular. So she had to use fashion in this almost drag way. The chapter where I write about her dressing like Louis XIV is called Ride Like a Man. She started riding astride like Louis XIV did, posing for equestrian portraits in pants, which nobody had done, no woman had done in French royal history. And so there really was this sort of bid for a kind of I won't call it a transgender, but a differently gendered identity. And yet the kind of the revolutionary or the progressive, and maybe to us in our contemporary, more permissive and tolerant and pluralistic times, I would read it as, something, it's a positive development in French culture, right? That like a powerless, childless woman can define herself in some other way. But in fact, the fashions that she devised wound up also causing a lot of eliciting a very misogynistic and classist response also. So the little white dresses that she wore at her fantasy farm, the Petit Trianon, it was said that she was destroying all social distinctions in France because you could no longer tell the difference between a little shepherdess girl and the Queen of France. Marie-Antoinette famously commissioned a portrait of herself in one of these little simple dresses. And it caused such a fury at the exhibition at the Louvre that it had to be taken down. And it was said that they couldn't bear the French public, even though this portrait was painted 4 years before the revolution. Even the people who would one day be destroying the class system and the monarchy couldn't accept that a woman was daring to step outside of a particular social role that had been assigned to her. So there is this way in which fashion for her, and maybe for Swan too, I'll be curious to hear what you have to say, and or for Isabella Stewart Gardner, it was a double-edged sword. She could assert a kind of power and make a claim to rewriting a hierarchy, and then she was also really attacked for undermining certain hierarchies and certain expectations of how a man is supposed to look, how a woman is supposed to look, how a queen is supposed to look, and how a peasant is supposed to look. So fashion in her case really does have this kind of wonderfully ambivalent function and status. And so, yeah, I'm curious to hear how that kind of two-sidedness of fashion shows up in the work that both of you, Channing and Natalie, are doing.
Go ahead, Channing.
Fascinating stuff, Caroline. That's I'm learning from listening to you. But one of the things that I think Swan faced was, I think there was sort of the inherited sense of fashion as a way to mark status, right? Particularly class and not just class status, but certainly to assert oneself in a certain way. In Swan's context, he's asserting himself as queen, which is a status word within his own community, asserting himself as queen within the framework of balls that he hosted. But outside of those balls, Swan is not living as a woman. Swan is working day to day, dressed in a suit or some other very masculine outfit, taking care of horses and cleaning up stables and doing his daily job as a servant.
So he was a stable boy, or what was his job?
For a period of time, yes. Yeah. So
okay.
he was a carriage driver for for a former for a politician in Washington D.C. for a period of time. He was also a janitor for a period of time. So he had sort of manual labor positions,
right? Yeah,
and had not had a chance to, to gain much of an education before coming to Washington. So when he comes to Washington, he's able to get some tutoring from local benefactors. But within, once he gets to Washington, he's faced with, on the one hand, the whole world outside is totally against this gender fluidity, this sense of breaking the bounds of what a man and a Black man can be and express. So that's why the police are constantly on the lookout for raiding his gatherings. On the other hand, he is this sort of semi-worshipped figure within the community that celebrates his cross-dressing. So that's, I think, the double-edged sword for Swan. The majority of all of the men that I know of who gathered with Swan identified and lived as men outside of the drag gatherings. Within the drag gatherings, they call themselves by women's names. Some of them, sort of half of them. Some of them attended the balls as men in suits, and some of them attended as women in dresses with female names. So it's a sort of a complex picture. It's sort of like a recreation of elite society but an elite society in which Black men can play the roles of their choosing.
Yeah. Well, and also just the idea, I'm from Virginia, and to me, growing up, Washington was the big city, but it was an incredibly conservative place for fashion, even in the late 20th century. So to me, it's fascinating that this would take shape. Maybe it's necessary that it would take shape in a place as kind of conservative and Southern as DC. But I'm also intrigued by the idea that at the capital of the Republic, you have this kind of, forbidden, illegal, and I want to hear more about why would they get arrested? What was the law that said that they could be raided and arrested? But that you would have a queen at a ball in, where the president lives. So that also is, where did the term queen, do you know how they started using that and why?
In Washington, so it sort of goes back to the Civil War. So during the Civil War in 1862, as a matter of strategy, Abraham Lincoln sort of announces before the Emancipation Proclamation, which went into effect in 1863. So before that, Abraham Lincoln sets the boundaries of Washington, D.C. as sort of freedom territory. If the slave is able to make it into Washington, D.C., then he'll have the protection, he or she will have the protection of the federal government to be free. And the word gets out, and this is a strategy in order to get enslaved people to come to Washington, but also in order to get them to rebel against their masters, the Southern masters. So that strategy, I think, begins to mark DC as a desirable place for Black people to come to gather, and that continues for some decades in the future. DC is seen as a place where you can gain freedom, you can gain some level of education, you can gain access to employment, that can either with the government or with some sort of in some cases or with very powerful figures in the elite of Washington. So DC is marketed as a place that's attractive to the African American community. That's one part of it. The other part of it is there's a tradition, because of DC in 1862 being this place for emancipation. There is a holiday that's celebrated in Washington, D.C. called Emancipation Day. It used to be a huge deal in the 19th century. So post 1862, every year there's a huge parade in Washington, D.C. where all formerly enslaved people come out to celebrate their emancipation. And as part of that gathering, there's a parade that is reviewed by the president, and he waves from the White House and so on as they go down Pennsylvania Avenue. And in this parade, which is considered an embarrassment by some of the elite blacks of Washington, those wealthy, powerful blacks of Washington think this parade is an embarrassment because these are people. One, they're out dressed in things that we don't approve of because they're making noise, and they're remembering something that everybody wants to forget.
Right. Yeah.
So one of the elements that galled them the most was a float covered in flowers, in which there was a black woman who wore a crown and a long white dress, and she was deemed to be the goddess of liberty or the queen of liberty.
Oh, wow. Okay. Wow. You know that during the French Revolution, as a sidebar, they tried, when they got rid of the Catholic Church, the revolutionary government realized that the people probably needed some sort of moral system or religion, and they tried to invent a religion featuring a goddess of liberty, and they had a big ceremony like crowning her in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, but the whole thing was discredited. I'm imagining she was white, but the whole thing was discredited when it was discovered that she had been a prostitute. So it was kind of, again, that sort of undermining this attempt. But so the goddess of liberty or the queen of liberty, and you think Swann borrowed that kind of idea for?
That's the most obvious cultural reference that I know he would have had.
Yeah, yeah. Wow.
And I see there's some questions in the chat that, do you mind if Natalie, if we?
No, I don't.
Because there's one.
Yeah.
Okay, one of them is from Susan Wilson. In Negro Dive rated, do we know if they were gay men or simply straight male cross-dressers? Okay, this is a really complicated question, but so nobody identified as male or as gay or straight in 1887. There's one thing. But if what you're asking is, were they attracted to men or attracted to women? We know that some of them were attracted to both, and some were attracted, but most were attracted to other men. We know that because of commentary from prosecutors and others about and judges who judge them harshly for the kinds of for what they describe, for sort of their judge them harshly for their sexual attractions and behavior. Some of these were people who were married, but in Swan's case, he was never married, and as far as I know, only had relationships with other men. So that's the answer to the question as best I can make it. And the cakewalk was sort of behind the cakewalk is enslaved people during the era of slavery were, as a way of sort of talking back to their masters, would mock their masters' form of movement. So they would mock the way their masters walked, so their stiff backs, their sort of strutting, wearing sort of these ornate outfits that Caroline is describing. They would mock, the slaves thought this was hilarious, and they would mock them. And the mocking walk became stylized into a dance that, on the one hand, allowed the slaves to express themselves in sort of a satire, it's sort of a social commentary, in a way that the masters didn't understand and would reward. So oftentimes the masters would choose the best dancer, and the best dancer would receive a cake. And this form of social commentary and dance expression continued for many decades into the 20th century. So that's why it's called a cakewalk.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions here, many of them for you individually, but let me go to one that is for both of you. And then we'll come back to the questions for individual speakers, if that's okay. You have all spoken eloquently about how these historical figures asserted themselves through their clothing. Do you think there was also an element of protecting or even hiding their private selves behind the visually stunning public images they created through their elaborate style?
I think that's
Yeah.
Caroline.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think methodologically, one of the things that I find challenging as a biographer is to make sure, and I do this as rigorously as I can, to avoid the temptation of imputing to my subjects private thoughts that I don't know that they had. Things I don't have documentation for. And it's a tough thing. I don't know if my fellow biographers have had that experience too, but you're living with your subjects for a long time and you feel like you know them well. And so there are circumstances where you can imagine what they probably would have done in a certain place, but I'm not writing fiction, and so I don't get to invent it, and I sort of insist on that standard. So I will say that with Marie-Antoinette, one of the reasons fashion was so valuable to me as a way of understanding her is that I had very little access to her private thoughts. She was somebody who, she didn't keep a diary, as far as we know. She corresponded copiously, especially with her mother, who was the Empress of Austria, until her mother's death in, I think, the early 1780s. But she knew that every letter that she wrote would be opened and read many times by spies and between Versailles and Vienna. So she essentially had no private expression that I had access to. Again, I can, there are places where I know, or, other commentators, people who lived at court will say the Queen is sad today because her son died, for instance. She and Louis XVI did wind up having kids, and she lost two of them very, very early. So, people might ascribe in the day feelings to her, but I think so. For me, I wanted to rely on fashion because it was based on choices she was making. She was at every turn choosing not to wear the things that were very kind of ritually, formally expected of her as the Queen of France, kind of as part of this elaborate system of etiquette and self-display that Louis XIV had devised 100 years earlier. She was making these choices that showed a kind of a subjectivity, but that was most of what I had to go on about her individuality. So I would be hesitant to talk about what she was hiding underneath because I didn't have access to it. Writing my book about these society women in Belle Époque Paris who inspired Marcel Proust's character, the Duchess de Guermantes, I had not the opposite problem, but I had access especially from some of their very generous descendants, to thousands of pages of their private correspondence. And so I can tell you absolutely that kind of the most fashion forward of those three women was this woman, Elizabeth Greffud, who basically dressed as some kind of queen or goddess at every public event she went to. And she was known as the most beautiful. She was the richest of the women in the aristocracy in Paris in her day. And she was famous for being this great beauty. And that's how she would appear. But these kind of very elaborate and eye-catching costumes that she would spend, months and months devising just for like one appearance of 10 minutes at the opera or something, where she would go in intermission when she knew everybody would be looking at her box. She'd kind of swirl around and then she would leave, and she would have spent 6 months planning that appearance. I learned from her private correspondence that she was one of the most miserable people you can possibly imagine. Her husband was physically violent to her. She was really quite in love with the man she married, even though it was an arranged marriage, like most aristocratic marriages at that time. Her husband was cheating on her with dozens of people, dozens of women all the time. When he died, 300 women came out of the woodwork with documents that they had gotten from him saying that they were his real wife in his heart and they should get the fortune. And so Elizabeth Greffud basically was hiding this incredibly miserable domestic life that was a big secret by staging herself as this great beauty. So it was a joy as a biographer for me to get to read. I'll never forget the first day I opened up a box of her private archives in Paris. I was reading her wedding diary, and her honeymoon was like 2 months long or something. And about 3 weeks into the honeymoon, all of a sudden there were tear stains all over the pages. And she had figured out that this guy she was madly in love with, or so she thought, was carrying on an affair with one of the women who was visiting them every day from the castle next door. So clothing really became this kind of public armor for her to hide her humiliation and to hide her her misery. But with Marie-Antoinette, as miserable as I can imagine she was in many circumstances, fashion was kind of my only way in. I couldn't talk about what her fashions were hiding because I don't have anything else really to go on than that kind of cultivated appearance that she was always working on and presenting to the public.
I think, Caroline, I faced a very similar situation because the archive available of what Swan's life was about doesn't often give me his own words, right?
Yeah.
It just shows me what he did.
Right.
And
yeah,
it shows
exactly.
me the events that are happening around him. And so that's what I have to work with. On the one hand, if you're to ask me, was his fashion choices hiding something? I mean, what it strikes me that, okay, on the one hand, we don't have his words specifically addressing that. On the other hand, we know that through his own choice, he was rebelling against the society's, expectations for what he would be doing, and particularly for somebody who's a formerly enslaved Black laborer. For him to choose to go out of his way to find, steal, and create outfits that were appropriate for an upper class woman.
Those bogus diamonds and that blonde wig with bangs. Yeah. Yeah, I know. I don't think that was just lying around. He had to go out of his way to find something like that, right?
So I think in some ways, right, you have to assume that his real outfit is sort of, I mean, real is the wrong word. I misspoke. It's sort of his day-to-day outfit represents himself in some ways less than what he's wearing at the drag ball, or at least does not represent his entire being, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's the closest that I could get, sort of, logically, that makes the most sense to me. Otherwise, what he's doing.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Let's go to a question for Carolyn. Now, there's praise for your work ahead of this. We're going to forward all of these questions to the presenter. So
thank you.
We'll send all those. But let's just get directly to the question itself. You said that you were struck by how often people mention Marie-Antoinette's clothing in the midst of weighty political discussions. In my research, when I find people criticizing my subject's appearance, I have found it simply as a reflection of the critic's insecurities. But I love using the idea of using those criticisms to tell more about my subject, not just the critics. Could you say a bit more about using others' views of your subject to tell more about and interpret the subject, her/himself?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And of course, I'm curious to know who your subjects are. So please put that in the chat when I get it. I'd love to see, who the person who's asked me that question is writing about. I would say that with Marie-Antoinette, those kind of political comments all the time are these very serious and largely very poorly dressed Jacobin statesmen kind of complaining about the Queen's clothes. Really helped me understand the politics of what she was doing more. They would say things like, in the middle again of some debate about the price of corn, they would say, and can you believe that the Queen was seen in the Tuileries wearing a purple dress with green ribbons? And I would think, why is that something that they're so angry about? And doing research, I would discover that, for instance, purple, of course, is the color of royalty. And so at a particular moment when things were really turning against the monarchy and the revolution, Marie-Antoinette's choice to wear purple, which had never been one of her favorite colors, seemed like she was kind of trying to communicate with a public that was largely hostile to her, saying, I still believe in this institution, that Marie-Antoinette one thing that's less sympathetic about her, I think, to a contemporary American reader is the idea that she really believed that she and her husband had been chosen by God to rule over ordinary humanity. So the sort of purple dress that was rightly taken by the Jacobins as a slap in the face was, I think, something that she intended as such. And so, yeah, kind of seeing that political criticism of her, yeah, sure, there's insecurity. Sure, there's certainly an absolutely misogyny, xenophobia, classist tensions that are all kind of coming through in a lot of criticism of her clothes. But yeah, reading those criticisms not just as an individual's insecurities, but really as a statement of, this is what the political landscape looked like then. This is what something like these colors could mean to people other than Marie Antoinette. This was the kind of, she was operating with a visual vocabulary that other people shared. So kind of finding what people have to criticize about what your subject is wearing, I think, is a way to kind of find out more about what the shared visual vocabulary is, even if it's a visual vocabulary that your subject, like my subject, is very invested in kind of tinkering with and rewriting to serve their own purposes. So yeah, I think that's wonderful. And then, with my favorite, I think I put this in some part of my book about Proust Duchess, but this woman, the Countess Greffule I was talking about before, the great beauty who just spent endless amounts of time and money staging these appearances of her beauty, she didn't get a lot of criticism for that. What she got was just an insane amount of fan mail. And so I wrote somewhere in my book that my favorite box in her archive that was like 220 maybe gigantic boxes, huge cardboard boxes just full of papers. One of them was labeled "Homages and Appreciations from People I Don't Know." And it was like just full to the brim with people saying, "You're so beautiful. And when I saw you in that Worth dress at the races, and I knew that with that delicate tone against your skin, you were truly the goddess we've all been waiting for." So in Elizabeth's case, she got a lot more fan mail than criticism, but that also told me something that helped me to understand Marcel Proust, who was himself a bourgeois guy, half Jewish, gay, and Proust was born in 1870, and there were words, at least in Paris, that people who we today call queer, or variants on that term, were using for themselves. Proust's term was pederasty and inversion were the two terms that he used that were that he didn't use pejoratively about himself, but I couldn't really understand in the beginning, why did Proust care about these high society ladies so much? He didn't belong to their world. What was it that made them so obsess him so much that he kind of followed these three women around Paris for years, and then wrote this character, the Duchess de Guermantes, who's kind of the queen of Paris in his novel. And seeing this intense amount of fan mail that was generated by Elizabeth Greffule, so the inverse again of these kind of critics about somebody commenting on your subject, helped me understand, oh, this was a whole culture that was in love with the aristocracy. 100 years after the French Revolution, these people couldn't get enough of these grandes dames and their privilege and their kind of elite and expensive lifestyle. And so that kind of outpouring of fan mail helped me understand a little bit more about another of my subjects, Marcel Proust, and how he was really a creature of his time. I'm not saying I think it was great that this man who was a certifiable literary genius was spending all of his time thinking about what some great lady was wearing to a ball, but it helped me understand more that he was, again, part of a broader cultural conversation.
Thank you. Let's go to a question for Channing. I was struck by the fact that one of the garments specifically noted was a Mother Hubbard. As a follower of modern drag culture, in many ways, they are so similar to a kaftan. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Do you think this style was worn because of the form, which is loose and uncorseted, and thus could fit a wider range of bodies? Or do you think that as a garment often associated with the dress reform and aesthetic arts movements, it was chosen for those representations?
Well, what we do know is that the Mother Hubbard was worn by a particular person at this particular ball. It was not worn by all of the people at the ball. So I think it was probably chosen less for what it represented than what the person who chose it felt like wearing. So it's maybe a simpler question than we we're expecting. That would be my answer. I think we don't really know. I mean, when you ask somebody, why did you wear what you wore, today? And I don't know. I don't know why I wore this. I just felt like it.
All right, thank you. We have a request for Natalie, if she would answer the question about hiding behind fashion.
So in writing about Isabella and her fashion, I think I do see that it's both her putting herself on display and saying things she can't say, asserting things she cannot say with words. And, that she had a very flamboyant side, and that's the side that got reported on in the newspapers, but the side that I've been finding in the archives, in her archives, is a much more tender, much more, not fragile, but tender-hearted person that didn't get represented necessarily in how she was talked about in the newspapers. So I started to think about her fashion as a way for her to claim she was very interested in power. She wasn't interested in political power. She wasn't interested in the vote, or at least in the 1880s. But she was very interested in cultural and social power. And she had gone to school in Paris as a young girl, so she had a schooling in how fashion and how what you wore could assert a kind of identity. And I think it also is how she negotiated this complex relationship between America and Europe, right? This feeling in America that we were always culturally behind Europe. And fashion would be a way, if she could be fashionable, if she could have the best dresses from Worth and the best pearls from Beaucheron, and then she would be seen as someone who was sophisticated, like the Europeans were. And that was just because in that era there was this feeling that Americans were behind in certain aspects of cultural life. So that's not quite talking about how she hid, but I'm still sorting that out. I'm still sorting out how she used fashion as a vocabulary. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. Let's do another question for Caroline. I understand that Marie-Antoinette was ceremonially disrobed and reattired when she first entered French territory. How much fashion was specifically French, and what did that mean?
Yeah, that's the opening scene of my book, is her ceremonial disrobement at the kind of symbolic transfer of her from her mother's territories in Austria and to her new husband's territories in France. But the funny thing is, and I think it's an interesting thing to think about in connection with Isabella Stewart Gardner as well, is that Marie-Antoinette was already wearing French clothes when she got to the border between Austria and France. So she was ceremonially disrobed to kind of say, nothing about your past life back in Austria will accompany you now into your new life as the future Queen of France. But all of the courts around Europe, everybody, at a level like Marie-Antoinette, like if you belonged to a royal or an imperial family, all of your clothes came from Paris anyway. So the clothes they made her get rid of were clothes that she had already bought from all the great, Parisian, fashion or, clothing purveyors. But they were probably a little bit, we don't know what exactly she was wearing on that day. We know that her family bought her this whole elaborate new French wardrobe before she moved to France, and that she wore one of the best of those dresses on this day to meet her new French family, only to be told, yeah, sorry, you have to take that all off now because that's Austrian. What we do know, though, is that usually, especially with the advent during Marie-Antoinette's time of these marchands de mode, these female fashion kind of accessories purveyors, where all of a sudden dresses could be made to look new, from one day to the next, that fashion as we know it, as kind of a cycle of obsolescence, and one day it's in and the next day it's out, that really got going in Paris with the marchands de mode in the 1770s. And what that meant is that if you were in London or St. Petersburg or Vienna, waiting for the latest dispatches from Paris about what was fashionable, it was already over by the time it got to you. And I think that that's probably part of the problem for American women too. By the time they make the trip to Worth and do the ordering and come back to the States and throw the party where they get to wear the outfit, women in Paris have moved on. So in that sense, you know, it's kind of, it always makes me sad to think about Marie Antoinette at age 15, probably. And again, I didn't put this in print because I can't say what I didn't know she felt, but like, I imagine that she was probably pretty proud of herself wearing her new Paris outfit, and then she had to take it off because it was symbolically Austrian. So yeah, I also speculate that, you know, that having that as your being ritually disrobed in front of a bunch of strangers when you're a teenage girl is probably not a great, and a teenage girl who's been separated from her family and will never see any of them again, that's probably not a great experience. That probably doesn't feel very good. And it also probably teaches you on your first day on the job as a French royal, like, oh, what I'm wearing is something that people are really going to care about a lot. What I'm wearing is something that's invested with a kind of a crazy degree of geopolitical importance that maybe it didn't have when I was just a little girl running around the garden in my mom's palace in Vienna.
Great, thank you very much. I think we're coming up on time here. So there are still a lot of questions that we did not get to, but rest assured that we will make copies of them and share them with our presenters, and also some very kind comments from the audience. So thank you very much. I'll turn this back over to Natalie if you have any concluding remarks.
Oh, my concluding remarks are just a full-hearted thank you so much for reconvening the panel, and you can see, I think all the audience can see why we were so sad not to be able to talk together last year. So I was just so delighted that we were able to talk together this year. So thank you again, and thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Kid and Katie. So
thank you, Natalie. Thank you all.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. We hope to see you next season. I'm sure we will be announcing the schedule sometime in the summer, but some wonderful biography programs coming next year as well. So thank you, everyone, and do check out our website and tune in to other MHS programs. Have a great evening.